On February 24, 2022, you addressed your country and nation when the conflict began in Ukraine. You said that you are acting because you have come to the conclusion that with the help of NATO the US can launch a surprise attack. An attack on your country. For Americans, this is like paranoia. Why do you think that America could deliver an unexpected blow to Russia? How did you come to this conclusion? It's not that America was going to launch a surprise attack on Russia. I never said so. Are we on a talk show or are we having a serious conversation?
Here's the quote. Thank you.
This is a great quote. Thank you. We're having a serious conversation. Your basic education is historical, as far as I understand, right? Yes.
Yes.
Then I will allow myself to simply give you a little historical background in 30 seconds or 1 minute. Do you mind? Please? Of course. Look. How did our relations with Ukraine begin? Where did Ukraine come from? The Russian state began to be built as a centralized one. This is considered the year of the creation of the Russian state. The year 862. When the Novgorodians. There is a city of Novgorod in the northwest of our country. Invited Prince Rurik from Scandinavia. From the Varangians to reign. This was in 862. In 1862. Russia celebrated the 1000th anniversary of its statehood. And in Novgorod there is a monument dedicated to the 1000th anniversary of the country. In 882, Rurik's successor, Prince Oleg, came to Kiev. He essentially performed the functions of a regent for Rurik's young son. And Rurik had already died by this time. He removed from power two brothers who, apparently, were once members of Rurik's squad. And thus Russia began to develop. Having two centers in Kiev and in Novgorod. The next very significant date in the history of Russia is 988. This is the baptism of Russes. When Prince Vladimir, the great-grandson of Rurik, baptized Russes and accepted Orthodoxy, Eastern Christianity, from that time on, the centralized Russian state began to strengthen. Why? A single territory, single economic ties, one language. And after the baptism of Russes there was one faith and the power of the prince. A centralized Russian state began to be built. But for various reasons, after the introduction of succession to the throne, also in ancient times, in the Middle Ages by Yaroslav the Wise, a little later, after he passed away, succession to the throne was complex. It was passed not directly from father to eldest son, but from the deceased from the life of the prince to his brother, then to his sons along different lines. All this led to the fragmentation of Russes, a single state, that began to be built as one. There is nothing special about this. The same thing happened in Europe. But the fragmented Russian state became easy prey for the empire that Genghis Khan once created. His successors, Batu Khan, came to Russes. They plundered almost all the cities. They ruined them. The southern part, where Kiev was, by the way, some other cities, they simply lost their independence. And the northern cities retained part of their sovereignty. They paid tribute to the horde, but retained part of their sovereignty. And then, with the center in Moscow, a unified Russian state began to be built. The southern part of the Russian lands, including Kiev, began to gradually gravitate towards another magnet, towards the center. That was taking shape in Europe. This was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. It was even called the Lithuanian Russian Principality because Russians made up a significant part of this state. They spoke Old Russian. They were Orthodox. But then the union of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland took place. A few years later, another union was signed in the spiritual sphere, and some Orthodox priests submitted to the authority of the Pope. Thus, these lands became part of the Polish-Lithuanian state. But over the course of decades, the Poles turned this part of the population into Poles. They introduced their language there. They began to introduce the idea that these are not entirely Russians, that since they live near the region, they are Ukrainians. Initially, the word Ukrainian meant that a person lives on the outskirts of the state, near the edge, or a person is engaged in border service. In fact, it did not mean any particular ethnic group. So, the Poles did their best to turn these people into Poles, and, in principle, they treated this part of the Russian lands quite harshly, if not cruelly. All this led to the fact that this part of the Russian lands began to fight for their rights. And they wrote letters to Warsaw, demanding respect for their rights, so that they would send people here, including to Kiev.
I beg your pardon, can you tell us what period?
When was this? In what years? This was in the 13th century. I will now tell you what happened next, and I will give the dates so that there is no confusion. And in 1654, even a little earlier, the people who controlled power in this part of the Russian lands turned to Warsaw. I repeat, they demanded that they sent to them people of Russian origin and the Orthodox faith, and when Warsaw, in principle, did not answer them anything, and it almost seemed to reject these demands, they began to turn to Moscow so that Moscow would take them to itself, so that you don't think that I came up with something. I will give you these documents.
Well, it doesn't sound like you're inventing it.
I don't think you're making things up, no, and yet, these are documents from the archive. These are copies. Here are letters from Bohdan Khmelnytsky, then the man who controlled power in this part of the Russian lands that we now call Ukraine. He wrote to Warsaw demanding respect for their rights, and after he was refused, he began to write letters to Moscow asking him to take them under the strong hand of the Moscow Tsar. Here are copies of these documents. I will leave them for you as a good memory. There is a translation into Russian. Then you will translate them into English. Russia did not agree to accept them immediately because it proceeded from the fact that a war with Poland would begin. Still, in 1654, the Zemsky Sober, which was a representative body of power of the old Russian state, made a decision. This part of the old Russian lands became part of the Muscovite kingdom. As expected, the war with Poland began. It lasted 13 years. Then a truce was concluded. And just after the conclusion of this act of 1654, in my opinion, 32 years later, peace was concluded with Poland, eternal peace, as it was said then. And these lands, the entire left bank of the Dnieper, including Kiev, went to Russia. And the entire right bank of the Dnieper remained with Poland. Then, during the time of Catherine II, Russia returned all its historical lands, including the south and west. This all continued until the revolution and before the First World War. Taking advantage of these ideas of Ukrainization, The Austrian General Staff very actively began to promote the idea of Ukraine and Ukrainization. It is clear why. Because on the eve of the World War, of course, there was a desire to weaken a potential enemy. There was a desire to create favorable conditions for ourselves in the border zone, and this idea, once born in Poland, that the people living in this territory are not entirely Russian. They are supposedly a special ethnic group. That they are Ukrainians. This idea began to be promoted by the Austrian General Staff. Theorists of Ukrainian independence also emerged in the 19th century, who spoke about the need for Ukrainian independence, but it's true. All these pillars of Ukrainian independence said that it should have very good relations with Russia. They insisted on this. However, after the revolution of 1917, the Bolsheviks tried to restore statehood, and a civil war broke out, including the war with Poland. A peace was signed with Poland in 1921, according to which the western part, on the right bank of the Dnieper, again went to Poland. In 1939, after Poland collaborated with Hitler, and Poland collaborated with Hitler, and Hitler proposed. We have all these documents in the archives. He proposed to conclude peace with Poland, a treaty of friendship and alliance, but he demanded that Poland give back to Germany the so-called Danzig corridor, which connected the main part of Germany with Königsberg and East Prussia. After World War I, this part of the territory was given to Poland, and the city of Danzig replaced Danzig. Hitler begged them to give up these territories peacefully, but the Poles refused. But, nevertheless, the Poles collaborated with Hitler, and together they began to divide Czechoslovakia. Can I ask? You say that parts of Ukraine have actually been Russian lands for hundreds of years. Why didn't you just take them when you became president? 24 years ago? You had a weapon, after all. Why did you wait so long then? Now I will say that I am already finishing this historical information. It's boring, maybe.
It's not boring.
But it explains a lot. It's not boring. No, well, great. Then I am very pleased that you appreciated it. Thanks a lot. So, before World War II, when Poland collaborated with Germany, it refused to comply with Hitler's demands, but, nevertheless, it participated with Hitler in the division of Czechoslovakia. But, since Poland did not give up the Danzig corridor, the Poles nevertheless played too hard, and they forced Hitler to start World War II with them. Why did the war start on September 1, 1939 from Poland? Because Poland turned out to be intractable. Hitler had no choice in implementing his plans but to start with Poland. By the way, I read archival documents. The Soviet Union behaved very honestly. The Soviet Union asked Poland for permission to send its troops to help Czechoslovakia. But through the mouth of the then Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland it was said that even if Soviet planes fly towards Czechoslovakia through the territory of Poland, they will be shot down over the territory of Poland. Well, it doesn't matter. But the important thing is that the war began. And now Poland itself became a victim of the policy that it pursued towards Czechoslovakia. Because according to the well-known Molotov-Ribbentrop protocols, part of these territories went to Russia, including Western Ukraine, Russia, under the name of the Soviet Union, thus returned to its historical territories. After the victory in the Great Patriotic War, as we say, this is the World War II. All these territories were finally assigned to Russia, to the Soviet Union, and Poland. As compensation, it must be assumed, received Western, originally German, territories, the eastern part of Germany, part of its lands, Today these are the western regions of Poland, and, naturally, they again regained access to the Baltic Sea. They again regained Danzig, which began to be called in Polish. This is how this situation developed. When the Soviet Union was formed, this is already 1922. The Bolsheviks began to form the USSR. And they created Soviet Ukraine, which before that did not exist at all. This is right. At the same time, Stalin insisted that these republics that were being formed should be included as autonomous entities. But for some reason the founder of the Soviet state, Lenin, insisted that they have the right to secede from the Soviet Union, and also for unknown reasons. He endowed the emerging Soviet Ukraine with lands and people who lived in these territories, even if they had never been called Ukraine before. For some reason, during its formation, all this was merged into the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, including the entire Black Sea region, which was received during the time of Catherine II, and, strictly speaking, which never had any historical relation to Ukraine. Even if we remember, if we go back to 1654, when these territories returned to the Russian Empire, there were 3 or 4 modern regions of Ukraine. There was no Black Sea region there. At that time there was simply nothing to talk about. In 1654? Yes, exactly.
You obviously have encyclopedic knowledge of...
You have encyclopedic knowledge. But why didn't you talk about this for the first 22 years of your presidency? So, Soviet Ukraine received a huge number of territories that never had anything to do with it at all, primarily the Black Sea region. They were once called Novorossiya when Russia received them as a result of the Russian-Turkish wars. But it is not important. The important thing is that Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, created Ukraine exactly like this. And for many decades, the Ukrainian Republic developed as part of the USSR, and the Bolsheviks, also for unknown reasons, were engaged in Ukrainization there. Not only because there were people from Ukraine in the leadership of the Soviet Union, but in general there was a policy called rooting. This concerned Ukraine and other Union republics. National languages and national cultures were introduced, which in general, in principle, of course, is not bad, but this is how Soviet Ukraine was created, and after World War II, Ukraine received another part of not only those territories that were Polish before the war. Today it is Western Ukraine, but also part of the Hungarian and Romanian territories. They also took part of the territories from Romania and Hungary. And these territories became part of Soviet Ukraine. And they are still there. Therefore, we have every reason to say, of course, that Ukraine, in a certain sense, is an artificial state created by the will of Stalin. Do you think Hungary has the right to take back its lands? And can other nations take back their lands? And maybe it is necessary to return Ukraine to the borders of 1654? I don't know how to return it to the borders of 1654. They call the time of Stalin's reign the Stalinist regime. Everyone says that there were many violations of human rights, violations of the rights of other states. In this sense, of course, it is quite possible, if we do not say that they have the right to do so, to return these lands of theirs, then, in any case, this is understandable. Have you told Orban that he can regain part of the lands of Ukraine? I never told him this. Never. Never once. We didn't have any conversations about this. But I know for sure that the Hungarians who live there, of course, want to return to their historical homeland. Moreover, I'll tell you a very interesting story now. I'll digress. This is a personal story. Around the beginning of the 1980s, I went by car from what was then Leningrad from St. Petersburg. On a trip through the Soviet Union, through Kiev. First I went to Kiev. And then I went to western Ukraine. I entered a city called Beregovo, and there all the names of cities and towns are in Russian and in Hungarian, which is incomprehensible to me. In Russian and Hungarian. Not in Ukrainian. But in Russian and Hungarian. I was driving through a village. Men in black three-piece suits and black top hats were sitting near the houses. I asked, "Are these some kind of artists?" They tell me, "No, these are not artists. These are Hungarians." I asked, "What are they doing here?" They told me that this is their land. They live here. All names here are in Hungarian. This was during Soviet times, in the 1980s. They retain the Hungarian language, names, and all national costumes. They are Hungarians and they feel like Hungarians. And of course, now they are being infringed upon. Yes. I think this happens often. Most likely. Many countries were unhappy with the changes in borders during the changes in the 20th century and before that. But the fact is that you did not state anything like this earlier. Until February 2022. And you said that you felt a physical threat from NATO. In particular a nuclear threat. And this prompted you to act. Do I understand you correctly? I understand that my long dialogues are probably not part of the interview genre. Therefore, at first I asked you, will we have a serious conversation or a show? You said this was a serious conversation, so don't be offended by me, please. We have come to the moment when Soviet Ukraine was created. Then there was 1991. There was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And everything that Ukraine received as a gift from Russia. From the master's shoulder. It took with it. I am now coming to a very important point today. After all, this collapse of the Soviet Union was initiated, in fact, by the Russian leadership. I don't know what motivated the Russian leadership then, but I suspect that there were several reasons to think that everything would be fine. Firstly, I think that the Russian leadership proceeded from the fundamental principles of relations between Russia and Ukraine. In fact, we have a common language. More than 90% of the people there spoke Russian. Family ties. Every third person there has some kind of family or friendly ties. General culture. General history. Finally, general religion. General presence within a single state for centuries. Our economies are very interconnected. These are all very fundamental things. All this underlies the inevitability of our good relations. Second, very important, I want you, as an American citizen, and for your viewers to also hear about this. The previous Russian leadership proceeded from the fact that the Soviet Union ceased to exist. No more ideological dividing lines exist. Russia even voluntarily and proactively agreed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it proceeds from the fact that this will be perceived by the so-called, in quotes, civilized West as an offer for cooperation and alliance. This is what Russia expected from both the United States and the so-called collective West as a whole. There were smart people, including in Germany, Egon Bahr. There was such a major political figure of the Social Democratic Party, who personally, in conversations with the Soviet leadership, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, said and insisted that it was necessary to create a new security system in Europe. We need to help Germany unite. But we need to create a new system that will include the United States, Canada, Russia, and other Central European countries. But there is no need for NATO to expand, that's what he said. If NATO spreads, everything will be the same as during the Cold War, only it will be closer to the borders of Russia, that's all. He was a smart old man. Nobody listened to him. Moreover, one day he got angry. We also have this conversation in the archives. He said that if you don't listen to me, then I will never come to Moscow again. He became angry with the Soviet leadership. He was right. Everything happened exactly as he said. Yes, of course. His words came true. You have spoken about this many times. It seems to me that this is absolutely fair, and many people in the United States also thought that relations between Russia and the United States would be normal after the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, the opposite happened. However, you never explained why you think this happened? Why did this happen? Yes. Maybe the West is afraid of a strong Russia. However, the West is not afraid of a strong China. The West fears a strong China more than a strong Russia because there are 150 million people in Russia and 1.5 billion people in China. And the Chinese economy is developing by leaps and bounds. More than and there was even more. But this is enough for China. Bismarck once said, the main thing is potentials. China's potential is colossal. It is the first economy in the world today in terms of purchasing power parity and economic volume. They have already overtaken the United States, and for quite some time now, and the pace is growing. We will not say now who is afraid of whom. Let's not talk in such categories. Let's talk about the fact that after 1991, when Russia expected that they would take it into the fraternal family of civilized peoples, but nothing like that happened. You deceived us. When I say the word you, of course, I don't mean you personally, but I mean the United States. They promised that there would be no NATO expansion to the east. But this happened 5 times. There were 5 waves of expansion. We endured all this. We persuaded them. We told them that they shouldn't do this. We are now our own, as they say here. Now we are bourgeois. We have a market economy. There is no power of the Communist Party. Let's come to an agreement. Moreover, I also already spoke about this publicly. Let us now take the Yeltsin era. There was a moment when a gray cat ran by. Before this, Yeltsin traveled to the United States. You remember? He spoke in Congress. And he said wonderful words. God bless America. He said everything. These were signals. Let us in, but no, events began in Yugoslavia. Before this, they praised Yeltsin very much, but as soon as the events began in Yugoslavia, and when he raised his voice for the Serbs, we could not help but raise our voices for the Serbs. In their defense, I understand that there were complex processes there. I understand that, but Russia could not help but raise its voice for the Serbs, because the Serbs are also a special nation close to us. They are an Orthodox culture, and so on. Well, this is such a long-suffering people for generations. Never mind, what is important is that Yeltsin spoke out in support of them. What did the United States do? In violation of international law and the UN Charter, the bombing of Belgrade began. The United States has let the genie out of the bottle. Moreover, when Russia objected and expressed its indignation, what was said? They said the UN Charter and international law were outdated. Now everyone refers to international law, but at that time they began to say that everything was outdated and that everything needed to be changed. Indeed, something needs to be changed because the balance of power has changed. It's true, but it doesn't need to be changed in this way. Yes, by the way, they immediately began to throw mud at Yeltsin, pointing out that he was an alcoholic, that he didn't understand anything, that he knows nothing. He understood everything, and he knows everything. I assure you. Well, okay, I became president in 2000. I thought, okay, that's all. The Yugoslav issue has passed. We must try to restore relations. We must still open this door that Russia was trying to get through. Moreover, I spoke about this publicly. I can repeat. At a meeting here in the Kremlin with Bill Clinton, who is leaving power, right next to him, in the next room, I told him. I asked him a question. Listen, Bill. How are you, do you think that if Russia raised the question of joining NATO, do you think it would be possible? Suddenly he said, you know, this is interesting. I think so. And in the evening, When we met at dinner, he said, "You know, I talked with my colleagues. With my team, no. Now this is impossible. You can ask him, I think. That if he hears our interview, he will confirm it. I would never have said anything like that if it hadn't happened. Well, okay. Now it's impossible." Were you sincere then? Would you join NATO? Listen. I asked him a question. Is it possible or not? And I got the answer, no. If I was insincere in my desire to find out the position of the US leadership. And if he said yes. Would you join NATO? If he said yes. The process of rapprochement would begin. And ultimately this could happen if we saw the sincere desire of our partners to do this. But it didn't end there. Well, if not, okay.
Why do you think that is?
Why do you think? What are the motives for this? I sense that you feel bitter about this. I understand that. But why do you think the West pushed you away then? Where does this hostility come from? Why couldn't the relationship improve? From your point of view, what were the motives for this? You said that I feel bitter about his answer. No, this is not bitterness. This is simply a statement of fact. We are not the bride and groom. Bitterness and resentment are not the substances that take place in such cases. We just realized that they weren't waiting for us there. That's all. Well, okay. But let's build relationships differently. Let's look for common ground. Why did we receive such a negative response? This is something you should ask your managers. I can only guess why. Because we are too big a country with our own opinions, and so on. But the United States. I have seen how issues are resolved in NATO. I will now give another example. Concerning Ukraine, the US leadership has pressed, and all NATO members are voting obediently, even if they don't like something. Now I will tell you in this regard what happened to Ukraine in 2008. Although this is being discussed, I will not tell you anything new here. However, then, after that, we tried to build relationships in different ways. For example, events took place in the Middle East, in Iraq. We built relations with the United States very gently and calmly. I have repeatedly raised the question that the United States should not support either separatism or terrorism in the North Caucasus. But they still continued to do it. And political support, information support, financial support, even military support came from the United States and its satellites in relation to terrorist groups in the Caucasus. I once raised this issue with my colleague, the President of the United States. He says that this cannot be. Do you have proof? I say yes. I was ready for this conversation, and I gave him this evidence. He looked at me, and, do you know what he said? I'm sorry. But it was. I'll quote it. He said, well, I'll punish them. We waited a long time for an answer. But there was no answer. I say to the director of the FSB, write to the CIA. Is there any result of the conversation with the president? He wrote twice, and then we received an answer. We have this answer in the archives. The answer came from the CIA. That they were working with the opposition in Russia, and they believe that this is correct, and that they will continue to work with the opposition. That's funny. Well, okay, we realized that there would be no conversation. Is this the opposition? Of course. In this case we meant the separatists. The terrorists who fought with us in the Caucasus. It was about them. They called it opposition. This is the second point. The third point, very important, is the issue of creating a US missile defense system. The beginning of this process, we spent a long time trying to persuade the United States not to do this. Moreover, after George Walker Bush's father, George Herbert Walker Bush, invited me to visit him overseas, a very serious conversation took place there with President Bush and his team. I proposed that the United States, Russia and Europe jointly create a missile defense system. We believe that if it is created unilaterally, it threatens our security, despite the fact that the United States officially said that it was created against missile threats from Iran. This is how they justified the creation of missile defense. I suggested that the three of them work, Russia, the USA and Europe. They said it was very interesting. They asked me, "Are you serious?" I say absolutely. When was this? In what year? I don't remember. This is easy to find out on the internet. When I was in the USA at the invitation of George Herbert Walker Bush. It's even easier to find out now. I'll tell you who you can find out from. They told me it was very interesting. I say, just imagine if we together solve such a global strategic task in the field of security, then the world will change. We will probably have disputes, probably economic and even political disputes, but we will radically change the situation in the world. He answers me, yes. They ask me, "Are you serious?" I say, "Of course. We need to think." They told me. I say, "Please." Then Secretary of Defense Gates, former director of the CIA, and Secretary of State Rice came here to this office where we are now talking. Here. At this table. On the contrary. You see this table. They sat on this side. I, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Defense of Russia from that side. They told me, yes, we thought, we agree. I say, thank God, great. But they agreed with some exceptions. That is, you twice described how American presidents made some decisions, and then their teams derailed these decisions? Exactly. In the end they sent us away. I won't tell you the details, because I think it's incorrect. After all, it was a confidential conversation. But it is a fact that our proposal was rejected. Then, it was then that I told them, listen, but then we will be forced to engage in retaliatory measures. We will create strike systems that will certainly overcome the missile defense system. Their answer was, we are not doing this against you, but you do what you want. We proceed from the fact that this is not against us, not against the United States. I say, okay, the process has begun, and we have created hypersonic systems, moreover, intercontinental range systems, and we continue to develop them. We are now ahead of everyone in creating hypersonic strike systems, both the United States and other countries. We improve these systems every day. But we didn't start this. We suggested going a different way, but they pushed us aside. Now regarding NATO's expansion to the east, well, they promised that there would be no NATO expansion to the east. There would be no inch to the east, as we were told. What then? Then they said that this was not recorded on paper. So they will expand NATO. There were 5 expansions. They included the Baltic states and all of Eastern Europe and so on. And now I come to the main thing. They reached Ukraine. In 2008, at the summit in Bucharest, they announced that the doors to NATO were open for Ukraine and Georgia. Now about how decisions are made there. Germany and France seem to be against this, as were some other European countries. But then, as it turned out later, President Bush, and he is such a strong guy. He is a strong politician. As they told me later, he put pressure on them, and they were forced to agree. That's funny. It's just like in kindergarten. Where are the guarantees? What kind of kindergarten is this? What kind of people are these? Who are they? They put pressure on them and they agreed. And then they say, Ukraine will not be in NATO. You know that. I tell them that I don't know. I know you agreed in 2008, but why won't you agree in the future? They say that then they put pressure on them. I tell them, why don't they put pressure on you tomorrow, and then you will agree again? Well, this is some nonsense. I just don't understand who to talk to there. We're ready to talk, but who to talk to? Where are the guarantees? There are no guarantees. This means that they began to develop the territory of Ukraine, whatever was there. I told the background, how this territory developed. what kind of relations there were with Russia. In Ukraine, every second or third person has always had some kind of connection with Russia. And during elections already an independent, sovereign Ukraine, which gained independence as a result of the Declaration of Independence, and, by the way, it is written there that Ukraine is a neutral state. And in 2008, they suddenly opened the doors, or gates, to NATO for it. This is an interesting movie. We didn't agree that way, so all the presidents who came to power in Ukraine relied on the electorate, which in one way or another treated Russia well. This is the southeast of Ukraine. This is a large number of people. And it was very difficult to defeat this electorate, which had a positive attitude towards Russia. Viktor Yanukovych came to power, moreover. For the first time he won after President Kuchma. And then they organized a third round, which is not provided for in the constitution of Ukraine. This is a coup d'etat, imagine. In the USA someone didn't like it. In 2014, no. That happened before. After President Kuchma, Viktor Yanukovych won the elections. But his opponents did not recognize this victory. The United States supported the opposition. And they scheduled a third round. What is this? This is a coup d'etat. The United States supported him. And he came to power as a result of the third round. Imagine that if someone in the US didn't like something, they would organize a third round of elections, which is not provided for in the US Constitution. But, nevertheless, they did it in Ukraine. Okay, Viktor Yushchenko, who was considered a pro-Western politician, came to power. Okay, we established a relationship with him too. He went to Moscow on visits. We went to Kiev. And I went there. We met in an informal setting. If he is pro-Western, let it be. Let it be. But people work. The situation must develop internally. In independent Ukraine itself. After he led the country, the situation worsened. And Viktor Yanukovych finally came to power. Maybe he was not the best president and politician. I don't know. I don't want to make judgments. But the question of association with the European Union arose. But we have always been very loyal to this. Welcome. But when we read this association agreement, it turned out that this was a problem for us. Because we had a free trade zone with Ukraine, open customs borders, and Ukraine, according to this association, had to open its borders to Europe. And then everything would go well flow into our market. We told them no. That this wouldn't work. Then we would close our borders with Ukraine. And there would be customs borders. Yanukovych began to calculate how much Ukraine would gain and how much it would lose. And he announced to his counterparties in Europe that he should think before signing. As soon as he said this, destructive actions began among the opposition, supported by the West. And everything came to the maiden in the coup in Ukraine. That is, Ukraine traded more with Russia than with the European Union? Certainly. It's not even a matter of trade volumes, although they were larger. The point is the cooperative ties on which the entire Ukrainian economy stood. Cooperation ties between our enterprises have been very close since the times of the Soviet Union. There, one enterprise produced components for final assembly in both Russia and Ukraine, and vice versa. There were very close ties. They carried out a coup, although I will not go into details now. I think this is incorrect, but still, the United States told us, you calm Yanukovych there, and we will calm the opposition. Let everything follow the path of political settlement. We told them, okay, we agree. Let's do it. As the Americans asked us, Yanukovych did not use either the armed forces or the police. And the armed opposition in Kiev carried out a coup. What does it mean, actually? Who are you? I wanted to ask these questions to the then leadership of the United States. With the support of whom did they do this? With the support of the CIA, of course. This is the organization in which, as I understand, you once wanted to work. Maybe, thank God, they didn't take you there. Although this is a serious organization, I understand that these are my former colleagues, in the sense that I worked in the first main directorate. This is the intelligence service of the Soviet Union. They have always been our opponents. Work is work. Technically, they did everything right. They achieved what they wanted. They changed power. But from a political point of view, this is a colossal mistake. Of course, the political leadership here has not done its job properly. The political leadership should have seen what this would lead to. So, in 2008, they opened the doors to Ukraine in NATO. In 2014 they carried out a coup d'etat. At the same time, they began to persecute those who did not recognize the coup d'etat, and it was precisely a coup d'etat. They created a threat to Crimea, which we were forced to take under our protection. They started the war in Donbas in 2014, using aviation and artillery against civilians. This is where it all started. There is a video recording of planes from above striking Donetsk. They launched one large-scale military operation. Then another. They failed. They are preparing more. And this is still against a backdrop of the military development of this territory and the opening of doors to NATO. Well, how can we not be concerned about what is happening? It would be criminally careless on our part. That's what it would be. It's just that the political leadership of the United States pushed us to a line beyond which we could no longer cross, because it would destroy Russia itself. And then we could not throw our co-religionists and, in fact, part of the Russian people under this military machine. That is, it was 8 years before the start of the conflict. What provoked this conflict when you decided that you still needed to take this step? Initially, the conflict was provoked by a coup d'etat in Ukraine. By the way, representatives of 3 European countries arrived: Germany, Poland and France, who were the guarantors of the signed agreement between the Yanukovych government and the opposition. They signed as guarantors. Despite this, the opposition carried out a coup d'etat, and all these countries pretended that they did not remember anything about the fact that they were the guarantors of a peaceful settlement. They immediately threw it into the oven. No one remembers. I don't know if people in the United States know anything about this agreement between the opposition and the government, and about the 3 guarantors who, instead of returning this whole process to the political field, supported the coup. Although there was no point in it, believe me, because President Yanukovych agreed with all this. He was ready for early elections, which he had no chance of winning. To be honest, he had no chance. Everyone knew this. But why stage a coup? Why are sacrifices needed? Why make threats against Crimea? Why did they then start operations in Donbas? I don't understand this. This is a miscalculation. The CIA completed its job in carrying out the coup d'etat, and, in my opinion, one of the deputy secretaries of state said that they even spent a large amount on this, almost $5 billion. But this is a colossal political mistake. Why did you have to do this? All the same things could have been done legally, without any casualties, without the start of military operations, and without the loss of Crimea by Ukraine. And we would not have lifted a finger if there had not been these bloody events on the Maidan. This would never have occurred to us, because we agreed that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, everything should be within the borders of the Union republics. We agreed with this. But we never agreed with the expansion of NATO, especially since we never agreed that Ukraine would be in NATO. We did not agree that there would be NATO bases there without any negotiations with us. We just begged them for decades. Don't do this. Don't do that. What was the trigger in recent events? Firstly, Today's leadership of Ukraine has stated that they will not implement the Minsk agreements, which were signed, as you know, after the events of 2014 in Minsk, where a plan for a peaceful settlement in Donbas was outlined. No, the leadership of today's Ukraine, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, all other officials, and then the president himself declared that they do not like anything in these Minsk agreements. In other words, they are not going to fulfill them. And the former leaders of Germany and France said directly today. A year and a half ago, they directly said, honestly, to the whole world, that yes, they signed these Minsk agreements, but they never intended to implement them. They just led us by the nose. Have you spoken with the Secretary of State? With the President? Maybe they were afraid to talk to you? And did you tell them that if they continue to pump Ukraine with weapons, then you will act? We talked about this constantly. We appealed to the leadership of the United States and European countries to stop this process immediately and to ensure that the Minsk agreements are implemented. Frankly, I didn't know how we would do it, but I was ready to do it. They are difficult for Ukraine. There are a lot of elements of independence for Donbas. For these territories, this is true. But I was absolutely sure. I will tell you now that I sincerely believed that if we manage to persuade those people who live in Donbas, they still had to be persuaded to return to the framework of Ukrainian statehood, then the wounds would gradually heal. Gradually. When this part of the territory returns to economic life, to the general social environment, when they pay pensions and social benefits, then gradually everything will grow together. No one wanted this. Everyone wanted to resolve the issue only with the help of military force. But we couldn't allow this. And it all came to this situation when it was announced in Ukraine that they would not carry out anything, and they also began preparations for military action. They started the war in 2014. Our goal is to end this war. And we didn't start the war in 2022. This is an attempt to stop it.
Do you think you've stopped it now?
Do you think you managed to stop it now? Have you achieved your goals? No, we have not yet achieved our goals. Because one of our goals is denazification. This refers to the prohibition of all neo-Nazi movements. This is one of the problems that we discussed during the negotiation process, which ended in Istanbul early last year. But it did not end on our initiative because, in particular, the Europeans told us that it was imperative to create conditions for the final signing of the documents. My colleagues in France and Germany said, "How do you imagine this? How will they sign the contract? With a gun to your head? Russia should withdraw its troops from Kiev." I tell them, okay. We withdrew our troops from Kiev. As soon as we withdrew our troops from Kiev, our Ukrainian negotiators immediately threw into the trash all our agreements reached in Istanbul. And they prepared for a long-armed confrontation with the help of the United States and its satellites in Europe. Here's how the situation developed. And this is how the situation looks now. What is denazification? What does this mean? I just want to say about this now. This is a very important question. Denazification. After gaining independence, Ukraine began to search, as some analysts in the West say, for its identity. And they didn't come up with anything better than to put the false heroes who collaborated with Hitler at the forefront of this identity. I have already said That at the beginning tourists of independence and sovereignty of Ukraine appeared. They proceeded from the fact that they didn't want to put out this fire of Ukrainian nationalism. How to do it? Listen to me. Your question is very subtle. And let me tell you what I think. You won't be offended? Of course I won't be offended. It would seem that this is a very vile question. You say that Hitler has been gone for many years. 80 years. But his business lives on. The people who destroyed Jews, Russians and Poles are still alive. And the president, the current president of today's Ukraine, applauds him in the Canadian Parliament. He gives him a standing ovation. How can we say that we have completely uprooted this ideology if what we see is happening today? This is what denazification is in our understanding. We need to get rid of those people who abandon this theory and practice in life and try to preserve it. That's what denazification is. This is what we mean by it, okay? Of course. I am not defending Nazism or neo-Nazism, but my question is in practical terms. You do not control the whole country. And it seems to me as if you want to control it all. But how can you then uproot ideology, culture, some feelings, history in a country that you do not control? How to achieve this, you know. No matter how strange it may seem to you. During the negotiations in Istanbul, we nevertheless agreed that it was all there in writing. That neo-Nazism would not be cultivated in Ukraine, including that it would be prohibited at the legislative level. Mr. Carlson, we agreed on this. It turns out that this can be done during the negotiation process. And there is nothing humiliating here for Ukraine as a modern civilized state. Is any state allowed to promote Nazi propaganda? It isn't, right? That's all. Will there be negotiations? And why have there been no such negotiations, peace negotiations, regarding the resolution of the conflict in Ukraine until now? They reached a very high stage of coordinating the positions of a complex process, but, nevertheless, they were practically completed. But after we withdrew our troops from Kiev, as I already said, the other side, Ukraine, threw out all these agreements and accepted the instructions of Western countries, European countries and the United States, to fight with Russia to the bitter end. Moreover, the president of Ukraine legally prohibited negotiations with Russia. He signed a decree prohibiting everyone from negotiating with Russia. But how will we negotiate if he forbade himself and forbade everyone? We know that he is putting forward some ideas about this settlement. But in order to agree on something, you need to conduct a dialogue, right? Yes. But you won't talk to the Ukrainian president. You will talk to the American president. When was the last time you spoke with Joe Biden? I don't remember when I talked to him. I don't remember. But you can find out. You do not remember? No. Do I really have to remember everything?
Well, he's funding the war that you're...
I have a lot of things to do. We have internal political affairs, but he is funding the war you are waging. Yes, he finances the war, but when I talked to him, it was before the start of the special military operation. Naturally, I told him then, I won't go into details, I never do this, but I then told him the following: I believe that you are committing a huge mistake of historical proportions if you support everything that is happening in Ukraine, pushing Russia away. I told him about this. By the way, I told him this more than once. I think it's fair to say it here. I'll leave it at that. What did he say? You ask him. Please. It's easy for you. You're a citizen of the United States. Go and ask him. It is inappropriate for me to comment on our conversation, but since then, after February 2022, you haven't spoken to him? No, we didn't talk. But we have certain contacts. By the way, do you remember I told you about my proposal to work together on a missile defense system? Yes. You can ask everyone this. They are all alive and well. Thank God. Both the former president and Condoleezza Rice are alive and well, and, in my opinion, Mr. Gates and the current director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Mr. Burns, he was then ambassador to Russia, in my opinion. He was a very successful ambassador. They are all witnesses to these conversations. Ask them. It's the same here. If you are interested in what Mr. President Biden answered me, ask him. In any case, he and I talked about this topic. I understand this perfectly well. But from the outside, for an outside observer, it may seem that all this could result in a situation where the whole world would be on the brink of war. Maybe even nuclear strikes would be launched. Why don't you call Biden and say, let's somehow resolve this question? What to resolve? Everything is very simple. I repeat. We have contacts through various departments. I will tell you what we are saying on this matter and what we are conveying to the US leadership. If you really want to stop hostilities, you need to stop the supply of weapons. And then everything will end within a few weeks. That's all, and then it will be possible to agree on some conditions. But before you do, stop supplying weapons. What could be simpler? Why should I call him? What to talk about? Or what to ask for? Are you going to supply certain weapons to Ukraine? Oh. I'm very afraid. Please don't supply it. What to talk about? Do you think NATO is concerned that this could escalate into a global war or even a nuclear conflict? In any case, they talk about it. And they try to intimidate their population with an imaginary Russian threat. This is an obvious fact. And thinking people, not ordinary people, but thinking people, analysts, those involved in real politics, just smart people, they understand perfectly well that this is fake. The Russian threat is being inflated. Do you mean the threat of a Russian invasion? For example, in Poland or Latvia? Can you imagine a scenario where you send Russian troops to Poland? This is possible only in one case. If there is an attack on Russia from Poland, why? Because we have no interests either in Poland or in Latvia, anywhere. Why do we need this? We simply have no interests there. There are only threats. I think you are well aware that their argument is, yes, he invaded Ukraine. And therefore he has territorial claims throughout the continent. Are you saying unambiguously that you have no such territorial claims? This is absolutely impossible. There is no need to be an analyst. Getting involved in some kind of global war is contrary to common sense. And a global war will bring all of humanity to the brink of destruction. It is obvious. Of course there are deterrents. All the time they were scaring everyone with us that tomorrow Russia will use tactical nuclear weapons, tomorrow it will use something else, no, the day after tomorrow, so what? These are just horror stories for ordinary people. In order to extract additional money from US taxpayers, in order to extract additional money from European taxpayers for the confrontation with Russia in the Ukrainian theater of military operations, goal: to weaken Russia as much as possible. One of the senior senators, Chuck Schumer, seemed to say yesterday that we need to continue to fund Ukraine, or in the end, American soldiers will have to fight in Ukraine instead of Ukrainians. How do you evaluate such a statement? This is a provocation, and it is a cheap provocation. I don't understand why American soldiers should fight in Ukraine. There are mercenaries from the United States there. Most of the mercenaries are from Poland. In second place are mercenaries from the United States. In third place are mercenaries from Georgia. If someone has the desire to send regular troops, of course, this will put humanity on the brink of a very serious global conflict. It is obvious. Does the United States need this? For what? Thousands of kilometers from national territory, don't you have anything to do? You have a lot of problems at the border. You have problems with migration. You have problems with the national debt. $33+ trillion, don't you have anything to do? Do you need to fight in Ukraine? Wouldn't it be better to come to an agreement with Russia? To come to an agreement. Already understanding the situation. That is developing today, understanding that Russia will fight for its interests to the end, and understanding this, in fact, return to common sense. Begin to respect our country, its interests, and look for some solutions. It seems to me that this is much smarter and more rational. Who blew up Nord Stream?
I was busy that day.
Of course you did it. I was busy that day. I didn't blow up Nord Stream. You may personally have an alibi, but the CIA does not have such an alibi. Do you have evidence that NATO or the CIA did this? You know, I won't go into details, but in such cases we always say, look for someone who is interested. But in this case, we need to look not only for someone who is interested, but also for someone who can do it. Because there may be many interested. But not everyone can climb to the bottom of the Baltic Sea and carry out this explosion. These two components must be connected. Who is interested and who can? But I don't quite understand. This is the largest act of industrial terrorism in history, and what's more, it is the largest release of CO2 into the atmosphere. But given the fact that you and your intelligence services have evidence, why don't you present such evidence and win this propaganda war? In a propaganda war, it is very difficult to defeat the United States, because the United States controls all the world's media, as well as many European media. The ultimate beneficiary of the largest European media is American foundations. Don't you know this? Therefore, you can get involved in this work, but it is more expensive for yourself. We can simply highlight our sources of information, but we will not achieve results. It is already clear to the whole world what happened, and even American analysts speak directly about it. This is true, yes. But there is a question. You worked in Germany. This is well known. And the Germans clearly understand that their NATO partners did this. Of course, this dealt a blow to the German economy. Why then are the Germans silent? This confuses me. Why didn't the Germans say anything on this issue? This surprises me too. But today's German leadership is not guided by national interests, but it is guided by the interests of the collective West. Otherwise, it is difficult to explain the logic of their actions or inaction. After all, it's not just about Nord Stream 1, which they blew up. They damaged Nord Stream 2. But one pipe is alive and well, and it can supply gas to Europe. But Germany doesn't open it. We're ready, welcome. There is another route through Poland. It is called Yamal Europe, where a large flow of gas can also be carried out. Poland closed it. But Poland takes advantage of the Germans. It receives money from pan-European funds. And the main donor to these pan-European funds is Germany. To a certain extent, Germany feeds Poland. And they took and closed the route to Germany. For what? I don't understand. The Germans supply weapons to Ukraine and give it money. The second sponsor after the United States in terms of financial assistance to Ukraine is Germany. 2 gas routes pass through the territory of Ukraine. The Ukrainians closed one route. Open the second route. And welcome. Receive gas from Russia. But they don't open it. Why don't the Germans tell Ukraine, listen, guys, we are giving you both money and weapons. Please open the valve and let gas flow from Russia for us. Germany buys liquefied gas from Europe at exorbitant prices. This reduces the level of its competitiveness and the level of its economy as a whole to zero. Does Ukraine want Germany to give it money? Let Germany exist normally so that its economy works. They give money to Ukraine from there. No, they don't do that. Why? Ask them. Both here and in their heads are the same. The people there are very incompetent. Maybe the world is now divided into 2 hemispheres. One hemisphere with cheap energy, the other not. I want to ask a question. Now there is a multipolar world. Can you describe alliances, blocs, who is on whose side? In your opinion, listen, you said that the world is divided into 2 hemispheres. The head is divided into 2 hemispheres. One is responsible for one area of activity. The other is more creative, and so on, but it's still just one head. It is necessary for the world to be united, for security to be common, and not designed for this golden billion, and then, only in this case, the peace will be stable, sustainable and predictable. And as long as the head is divided into 2 parts, it is a disease. It is a serious disease. The world is going through this period of severe illness, but it seems to me that thanks, among other things, to honest journalism, journalists work like doctors, maybe it will be possible to somehow connect all this. I'll give you one example.
Well, let's just give one example.
The American dollar has united the whole world in many ways. Do you think the dollar will disappear as a reserve currency? How have sanctions changed the place of the dollar in the world? You know. This is one of the gravest strategic mistakes of the political leadership of the United States. The use of the dollar as an instrument of foreign policy struggle. The dollar is the main basis of US power. I think everyone understands this very well. No matter how many dollars you print, they fly all over the world. Inflation in the USA is minimal. In my opinion, 3%. Approximately 3.4%. Which is absolutely acceptable for the USA. And they print endlessly. Of course. What does $33 trillion in debt mean? This is the same issue. Nevertheless, this is the main weapon for maintaining US power in the world. As soon as the US political leadership decided to use the dollar as a tool of political struggle, they struck a blow at this American power. I don't want to use any unliterary expressions, but this is stupidity. This is a huge mistake. Look what's happening in the world, even among US allies. Dollar reserves are now dwindling. Everyone looks at what is happening. And everyone begins to look for ways to protect themselves. But if in relation to some countries the United States applies such restrictive measures as limiting transactions, freezing assets, and so on, then this is a huge alarm and a signal for the whole world. What was going on with us until 2022? Approximately 80% of Russian foreign trade transactions were in dollars and euros. At the same time, Dollars accounted for approximately 50% of our transactions with third countries, and now, in my opinion, only 13% remain. But it was not we who banned the use of the dollar. We did not strive for this. The United States has decided to limit our payments in dollars. I think this is complete nonsense. You understand? From the point of view of the interests of the United States itself, the taxpayers of the United States, because it hits the US economy. It undermines the power of the United States in the world. By the way, our transactions in yuan were approximately 3%. Now we pay 34% in rubles. And about the same, just over 34%, in yuan. Why did the United States do this? I can only explain this by their arrogance. They probably thought everything would collapse. But nothing did. Moreover, look, other countries, including oil-producing countries, are starting to say, and they are already doing it, they pay for the sale of oil in yuan. Do you understand what's going on or not? Does anyone understand this in the United States? What are you doing? You are pruning yourself. Ask all the experts. Ask any smart and thinking person in the United States. What is the dollar for the United States? You yourself are killing it. I think that's a really fair assessment. Next question. Maybe you exchanged one colonial power for another, but for a more gentle one? Could BRICS today be in danger of being dominated by a kinder colonial power, China? Is this good for sovereignty, do you think? Does this bother you? These horror stories are well known to us. This is a horror story. We are neighbors with China. Just like close relatives. You do not choose your neighbors. We have a common border of thousands of kilometers with them. This is the first. Second, we have been accustomed to living together for centuries. Third, China's foreign policy philosophy is non-aggressive. China's foreign policy thought is always looking for a compromise. And we see it. The next point is this. You tell us all the time. And you have now tried to present this horror story in a mild form, but, nevertheless, it is the same horror story. The volume of cooperation with China is growing. The growth rate of China's cooperation with Europe is greater and higher than the growth rate of China's cooperation with the Russian Federation. Ask Europeans if they are afraid. Maybe they are afraid, I don't know. But they are trying to get into the Chinese market at all costs. Especially when they are now facing problems in the economy. And Chinese enterprises are developing the European market. Isn't there a small presence of Chinese business in the United States? Yes. Political decisions are such that the United States is trying to limit cooperation with China. Mr. Tucker, you are doing this to your own detriment. By limiting cooperation with China, you are harming yourself. This is a delicate area. And there are no simple linear solutions here. It's the same as with the dollar. Therefore, before introducing any illegitimate sanctions, illegitimate from the point of view of the Charter of the United Nations, you need to think carefully. In my opinion, those who make decisions have problems with this. You said a minute ago.
So you said a moment ago
that today the world would be much better if there were no two competing alliances that compete with each other. Perhaps the current American administration, as you say, as you believe, is set against you. But maybe the next administration in the United States, the government after Joe Biden, will want to establish ties with you. Would you like to establish connections with them? Or does it not matter? I'll tell you now, but I'll finish answering the previous question. We have $200 billion. We set a goal with my colleague, with my friend, with Chairman Xi Jinping, that this year we should have reached $200 billion in trade turnover with China. And we have exceeded this bar. According to our data, this is already 230 billion. According to Chinese statistics, this is $240 billion. If everything is calculated in dollars, trade turnover with China. And there is a very important thing. Our trade turnover is balanced. We complement each other in the high-tech sector, in the energy sector, and in the field of scientific development. It's very balanced. And as for BRICS as a whole, Russia has become the chairman of BRICS since this year. And the BRICS countries are developing at a very fast pace. Look. God grant me the memory not to be mistaken. But in 1992, I think, the share of the G7 countries in the world economy was 47%. And in 2022 it has fallen, I think, to about 30%. The BRICS share was only 16% in 1992. But now it exceeds the G7 level. And this is not connected with any events in Ukraine. The trends in the development of the world and the global economy are as I have just mentioned, and this is inevitable. This will continue to happen. It's like the sun rising, it's impossible to prevent it. You need to adapt to it. How is the United States adapting? They do this using force, sanctions, pressure, bombing, the use of the armed forces. This has to do with overconfidence. People in your political elite do not understand that the world is changing due to objective circumstances. And you need to make the right decisions competently, on time and in a timely manner in order to maintain your level. Excuse me. Even if someone wants to maintain their level of dominance, such rude actions, including in relation to Russia, say, and in relation to other countries, lead to the opposite result. This is an obvious fact. It has already become obvious today. You ask me now that if another leader comes, will he change something? It's not about the leader. It's not about the personality of a particular person. I had a very good relationship with, say, Bush. I know that the United States portrayed him as some kind of country guy who doesn't understand much. I assure you that this is not so. I believe that he also made many mistakes regarding Russia. I told you about 2008 and about the decision in Bucharest to open the doors to NATO for Ukraine, and so on. This happened with him. He put pressure on the Europeans, but in general, on a human level, I had a very kind and good relationship with him. He is no stupider than any other American, Russian, or European politician. I assure you, he understood what he was doing, just like the others. Trump and I had such a personal relationship. It's not about the personality of the leader. It's about the mood of the elites. If the idea of domination at any cost, and with the help of force, prevails in American society, then nothing will change. It will only get worse. But, in the end, if the realization comes that the world is changing due to objective circumstances, and we must be able to adapt to them in time, using the advantages that the United States still retains today, perhaps then something can change. Look, the Chinese economy has become the first economy in the world in terms of purchasing power parity. In terms of volume, they have long overtaken the United States. Then comes the USA. And then comes India. There are 1.5 billion people there. Then comes Japan. And Russia comes in 5th place. Over the past year, Russia has become the first economy in Europe, despite all the sanctions and restrictions. From your point of view, is this normal? Sanctions, restrictions, impossibility of transactions in dollars, disconnection from SWIFT, sanctions against our ships carrying oil, sanctions against our aircraft, sanctions in everything and everywhere. The largest number of sanctions that are applied in the world are applied against Russia. But we became the first economy in Europe during this time. The tools the US is using are not working. Well, We need to think about what to do. If this realization comes to the ruling elites, then yes. Then the first person of the state will act in anticipation of what voters and people who make decisions at various levels expect from him. Then something might change. You describe two different systems. You say that the leader acts in the interests of the voters, but at the same time some decisions are made by the ruling classes. You have been leading the country for many years. With your experience, who do you think makes decisions in America? I don't know. America is a complex country. On the one hand it is conservative, on the other hand it is a rapidly changing country. It's not easy for us to figure this out. Who makes decisions in elections? Is it possible to understand this? Each state has its own legislation. Each state regulates itself. It can exclude someone from elections at the state level. This is a two-stage electoral system. It is very difficult for us to understand this. Of course, there are two parties that are dominant, Republicans and Democrats. And within this party system there are centers that make decisions and prepare decisions. Then, look, why, in my opinion, was such an erroneous, crude, completely unfounded policy of pressure carried out in relation to Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union? After all, this is a policy of pressure, NATO expansion, support for separatists in the Caucasus, creation of a missile defense system. These are all elements of pressure. There is a lot of pressure. Then Ukraine was dragged into NATO. It's all pressure. Why? I think that, among other things, this is because, relatively speaking, excess production capacity was created. During the fight against the Soviet Union, many different centers were created, and there were many specialists who worked on the Soviet Union who did not know how to do anything else. It seemed to them that they were convincing the political leadership that it was necessary to continue to hammer Russia. You must try to destroy it completely. It is necessary to create several quasi-state entities on this territory, and it is necessary to subjugate them in a divided form. We must use their combined potential for the future fight against China. This is a mistake. Among other things, due to the excess potential of those who worked to confront the Soviet Union, we need to get rid of this. There must be new, fresh forces. There must be people who look to the future and who understand what is happening in the world. Look how Indonesia is developing. There are 600 million people there. Where can we get away from this? Nowhere. We just have to assume that Indonesia will join. It is already joining the club of the world's leading economies. Be that as it may, whether anyone likes it or not. Yes, we understand, and we are aware that in the United States, despite all the economic problems, there is still a normal situation and significant economic growth. GDP growth of 2.5%, in my opinion. But in order to ensure the future, we need to change the approach to what is changing. As I already said, the world will change anyway, regardless of how the events in Ukraine end. The world is changing. In the United States itself, experts write that the United States is gradually changing its position in the world. Your experts write this. I read them. The only question is, how will this happen? Painfully? Quickly or gently? Gradually? And this is written by people who are not opposed to America. They simply observe development trends in the world. That's all. In order to evaluate them, in order to change policies, we need people who think, who look forward, who can analyze and recommend some decisions at the level of political leadership. I just have to ask you. You clearly said that NATO expansion was a violation of promises and it is a threat to your country. But before you sent troops to Ukraine, at a security conference, the US Vice President supported the desire of the President of Ukraine to join NATO. Do you think That this also provoked hostilities? I repeat once again that we have repeatedly proposed to seek a solution to the problems that arose in Ukraine after the 2014 coup d'etat through peaceful means, but no one listened to us, and moreover, the Ukrainian leadership, which was under complete control of the United States, suddenly announced that it would not implement the Minsk agreements, that they did not like anything there, and they continued military activity in this territory, and in parallel, this territory was being developed by NATO military structures under the guise of various centers for training and retraining of military personnel. In fact, they began to create military bases. That's all. Ukraine announced. They passed a law that the Russians are not a local nation. And at the same time they passed laws that limit the rights of non-local nations. In Ukraine, having received all these southeastern territories as a gift from the Russian people, suddenly announced that the Russians in this territory are not a local nation. This is fine? All this together led to our decision to end the war, which was started by neo-Nazis in Ukraine in 2014, by armed means. Do you think Zelensky has the freedom to negotiate a resolution to this conflict? I don't know. There are details there, of course, it's difficult for me to judge, but I think he has it, at least he had it. His father fought against the fascists, the Nazis during World War II. I once talked to him about this. I told him, Vladimir, well, what are you doing? Why are you supporting neo-Nazis in Ukraine today? After all, your father fought against fascism. He is a frontline soldier. I won't say what he answered. This is a separate topic. And I think it's incorrect. But as far as freedom of choice is concerned, why not? He came to power on the expectations of the Ukrainian population that he would lead Ukraine to peace. He talked about this. Because of this he won the elections with a huge advantage, but then, when he came to power, in my opinion, he realized two things. Firstly, it is better not to quarrel with neo-Nazis and nationalists, because they are aggressive and very active. You can expect anything from them. And secondly, the West, led by the United States, supports them. And it will always support those who fight Russia. It is profitable and safe. Then he took the corresponding position. Despite promises to his people to end the war in Ukraine, he deceived his voters. Do you think that now? In February 2024, he has the freedom to talk to your government, to try to somehow help his country? In general, can he do it himself? Why not? He considers himself the head of state. He won the elections, although we in Russia believe that everything that happened after 2014, after that the primary source of power is the coup d'etat. And in this sense, even today's government is flawed, but he considers himself president, and in this capacity he is recognized by the United States, all of Europe, and almost the entire rest of the world. Why not? He can. We negotiated with Ukraine in Istanbul. We agreed there. He knew about it. Moreover, the head of the negotiation group, I think his last name is Arakhamia. He still heads the faction of the ruling party, the party of the president in the Rada. He still heads the presidential faction in the Rada, in the country's parliament, and he still sits there. He even put his preliminary signature on this document that I am telling you about. But then he publicly announced to the whole world that they were ready to sign this document, but Mr. Johnson, the then British Prime Minister, arrived, who dissuaded them from this, and who said that they needed to fight with Russia. They will give them everything so that they can return what they lost during the clashes with Russia. And they agreed with this proposal. Look. His statement has been published. He said this publicly. Can they return to this or not? This is the question. Do they want it or not? And after that, Mr. President of Ukraine issued a decree prohibiting negotiations with us. Let him cancel this decree, and that's all. We have never refused negotiations. We hear all the time, is Russia ready? But we didn't refuse. They publicly refused. Well, let him cancel his decree and enter into negotiations. We never refused. And the fact that they submitted to the demands or persuasion of the former British Prime Minister Mr. Johnson, it seems to me that this is ridiculous and, how to say, it is very sad because, as Mr. Arakamiya said, a year and a half ago they could have stopped these hostilities, stopped this war, but the British persuaded them. And then they abandoned it. Where is Mr. Johnson now? And the war continues. That's a good question. Why did he do this? Hell, if I know. I don't understand it myself. This was the general attitude. For some reason, everyone has the illusion that Russia can be defeated on the battlefield. This is from arrogance. From a pure heart. But not from a great mind. You described the connection between Russia and Ukraine. You described Russia as an Orthodox country. You talked about this. What does this mean for you? You are the leader of a Christian country, as you describe yourself. How does this affect you? You know, as I already said. In 988, Prince Vladimir was baptized following the example of his grandmother, Princess Olga. And then he baptized his squad, and then, gradually, over the course of several years, he baptized all of Russias. It was a long process. From pagans to Christians. It took many years. But ultimately, this is Orthodoxy. Eastern Christianity. It is deeply rooted in the consciousness of the Russian people. When Russia expanded and absorbed other peoples who profess Islam, Buddhism, and Judaism, Russia has always been very loyal to those people who profess other religions. This is its strength. This is absolutely clear. And the fact is that in all the world religions that I just talked about and which are traditional religions of the Russian Federation, in fact, the main theses, the main values are very similar, if not to say that they are the same. And the Russian authorities have always been very careful about the culture and religion of those peoples who came into the Russian Empire. In my opinion, this forms the basis for the security and stability of Russian statehood. Because all the peoples inhabiting Russia, basically they all consider it their motherland. Let's say if people move to you from Latin America, or if people come to Europe, this is an even clearer and more understandable example. But they also came from their historical homeland to you, or to European countries. And people who profess different religions in Russia, they consider Russia their motherland. They have no other motherland. We are together. This is one big family, and our traditional values are very similar. When I said that this is one big family, but everyone has their own family, and this is the basis of our society. And if we say that the motherland and a particular family are very connected, then so it is. Because it is impossible to ensure a normal future for our children and for our family if we do not provide a normal, sustainable future for the entire country, for the motherland. That is why patriotism is so highly developed in Russia. If you will allow it. Religions are different. The fact is that Christianity is a non-violent religion. Christ says, turn the other cheek, do not kill, and so on. How can a leader be a Christian if he has to kill someone else? How can you reconcile this within yourself? This is very easy when it comes to protecting yourself and your family, your homeland. We don't attack anyone. How did the events in Ukraine begin? It started with the coup d'etat and with the beginning of hostilities in the Donbas. With this, and we protect our people, ourselves, our homeland and our future. As for religion in general, you know, it's not in external manifestations. It's not in going to church every day or banging your head on the floor. It's in the heart. And our culture is people-oriented. Dostoevsky, who is very well known in the West as the genius of Russian culture, Russian literature, spoke a lot about this, about the Russian soul. Still, Western society is more pragmatic. Russian people think more about the eternal. They think more about moral and ethical values. I don't know. Maybe you won't agree with me, but, nevertheless, Western culture is more pragmatic. I'm not saying that this is bad. It makes it possible for today's golden billion to achieve good success in production, even in science, and so on. There's nothing wrong with this. I'm just saying that we seem to look the same, but our consciousness is built a little differently. That is, you think
So do you see the supernatural at work?
that there is something supernatural at work here? When you look at what is happening in the world, do you see the works of the Lord? Do you tell yourself that here I see the actions of some superhuman forces? No. To be honest, I don't think so. I think that the world community develops according to its own internal laws, and they are what they are. There is no escape from this. It has always been this way in the history of mankind. Some peoples and countries rose, multiplied, became stronger, and then they left the international arena and the quality to which they were accustomed. I probably don't need to give these examples. Starting with the same horde conquerors, with Genghis Khan, then with the Golden Horde, ending with the great Roman Empire. In the history of mankind, it seems to me, there was nothing else like the great Roman Empire. However, the potential of the barbarians gradually accumulated, and under their blows the Roman Empire collapsed. Because there were more barbarians, they began to generally develop well, as we now say, economically. They began to strengthen, and the regime that was imposed on the world by the great Roman Empire collapsed. True, it took a long time to fall apart. 500 years. This process of disintegration of the great Roman Empire lasted 500 years. The difference with today's situation is that the processes of change today are much faster than during the times of the great Roman Empire. But then, when will the artificial intelligence empire begin? You are plunging me into more and more complex questions. In order to answer, of course, you need to be an expert in the field of large numbers. In the field of this artificial intelligence, humanity has many threats. Research in the field of genetics, which can create a Superman, a special person, a warrior person, a scientist person, an athlete person. Now they say that in the USA, Elon Musk has already implanted a chip in the brain of some person. What do you think of it? I think that Elon Musk cannot be stopped. He will still do what he considers necessary, but we need to somehow negotiate with him. We need to look for some ways to convince him. It seems to me that he is an intelligent person. That is, I am sure that he is an intelligent person. We need to somehow agree with him that this process needs to be canonized, subject to some rules, of course. Humanity must think about what will happen to it in connection with the development of these latest research and technologies in genetics or artificial intelligence. You can predict approximately what will happen. Therefore, when humanity felt a threat to its existence from nuclear weapons, all owners of nuclear weapons began to negotiate among themselves because they understood that the careless use of nuclear weapons could lead to complete, total destruction. When there is an understanding that the unlimited and uncontrolled development of artificial intelligence, or genetics, or some other modern trends cannot be stopped, then these studies will still be carried out. This is just as it was impossible to hide from humanity what gunpowder is, and it is impossible to stop research in one area or another. These studies will still happen. But when humanity feels a threat to itself, to humanity as a whole, it seems to me that then the time will come to agree at the interstate level on how we will regulate this. Thank you very much for the time you spent. I want to ask one more question. Evan Gershkovich. He is 32 years old. An American journalist. He has been in prison for more than a year. This is a big story in the USA. I want to ask you, are you ready, as a gesture of goodwill, to release him so that we can take him to the USA? We have made a lot of goodwill gestures, so I think we have reached our limits. No one has ever responded to our goodwill gestures with similar gestures, but, in principle, we are ready to say that we do not exclude the possibility that we can do this with counter-movement from our partners. And when I talk about partners, I mean, first of all, representatives of special services. They are in contact with each other and they are discussing this topic. We have no taboo about not solving this problem. We are ready to solve it. But there are certain conditions that are discussed through partner channels between the intelligence services. It seems to me that we can agree on this, of course.
So typically, this stuff has happened.
Everything happens over the course of centuries. A country catches a spy. It apprehends him. And then it changes him to someone else, of course. This is none of my business. But this situation is different in that this person is not a spy, he is just a child, and, of course, maybe he violated your legislation. However, he is not a spy, and it is absolutely certain that he did not spy. Maybe he is still in a different category? Perhaps it would be unfair to ask someone else in exchange for it, you know. You can say whatever you want about what a spy is and who is not a spy. But there are certain things provided by law. If a person receives secret information, if he does it on a secret basis, then this is called espionage. This is exactly what he did. He received closed, secret information. And he did it secretly. I don't know, maybe they got him involved. Somebody might get him involved in this thing. Maybe he did everything carelessly, on his own initiative. But in fact this is called espionage. And everything has been proven. Because we caught him red-handed when we received this information. If these were some far-fetched things, invented, unproven, then it would be a different story. We caught him red-handed when he received secret information on a secret basis. Well, what is this?
Are you suggesting that he was working?
Are you saying that he worked for the American government, for NATO? Or is he simply a journalist who received information That should not have ended up in his hands, it seems to me. After all, there is a difference between these two categories. I don't know who he worked for, but, I repeat once again, obtaining secret information on a secret basis is called espionage, and he worked in the interests of the American intelligence services, or some other structures. I don't think he worked for Monaco. It is unlikely that Monaco is interested in receiving this information. The intelligence services must agree among themselves. You understand? There are certain developments there. There are people there who, in our opinion, are also not connected with the special services. Listen. I'll tell you. In one country. In a country that is an ally of the United States. There is a man who, for patriotic reasons, eliminated a bandit in one of the European capitals. Do you know what he did during the events in the Caucasus? I don't want to say this, but, nevertheless, I will say it. He laid out our captured soldiers on the road. And then he drove a car over their heads. What kind of person is this? And is this a person? But there was a patriot who eliminated him in one of the European capitals. Whether he did this on his own initiative or not is another question. Evan Gershkovich didn't do anything like that. That's a completely different story. He did something else. He's just a journalist. He is not just a journalist. I repeat again, this is a journalist who received secret information on a secret basis. Well, yes, that's a completely different story. I'm just talking about those people who are essentially under the control of the US authorities, no matter where they are in prison. And there is a dialogue between the special services. This should be resolved quietly, calmly, and on a professional level. There are contacts. Let them work. I do not rule out that the person you mentioned, Mr. Gershkovich, may end up in his homeland. Why not? It is more or less pointless to keep him in prison in Russia. But let the colleagues of our intelligence officers on the American side also think about how to solve the problems that our intelligence services face. We are not closed to negotiations. Moreover, these negotiations are ongoing. And there have been many cases when we reached an agreement. We can come to an agreement now. But we just need to agree. I hope you release it. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would also like him to go home eventually. I say this completely sincerely, but, I repeat, there is a dialogue going on. The more we publicize things like this, the more difficult it is to solve them. Everything should be calm. To be honest, due to the war, I don't know if this works or not. If you allow me, I will ask one more question. Maybe you don't want to answer for strategic reasons. But aren't you worried that what's happening in Ukraine could lead to something much bigger and worse? And how ready are you? How motivated are you to call, for example, the United States and say, let's negotiate? Look, I already said. We didn't refuse negotiations. We are not refusing. It is the Western side that is refusing, and Ukraine, of course, is a satellite of the United States today. It is obvious, true. I don't want this to sound like some kind of curse or insult to someone. But we understand what's going on, right? They gave them financial support, $72 billion. Germany is in second place, as are other European countries. Tens of billions of dollars go to Ukraine. A huge flow of weapons is going there. You tell the current leadership of Ukraine, listen, let's sit down at the negotiating table. Come to an agreement. Cancel your stupid decree and sit down at the negotiating table. We didn't refuse. Yes. You have already said this. I understand perfectly well, of course, that this is not a curse, and, indeed, it was reported that they did not allow Ukraine to sign peace on the instructions of the former British Prime Minister, who acted on orders from Washington. That's why I ask, why don't you directly address these issues with the Biden administration, which controls the Zelensky administration in Ukraine? If the Zelensky administration in Ukraine refused to negotiate, I assume that they did so on instructions from Washington. If Washington sees that this is the wrong decision, then let them abandon it. Let them find some subtle excuse that won't offend anyone. Let them find this solution. We didn't make these decisions. They made this decision there. Let them refuse it. That's all. But they made the wrong decision. Now we have to look for a way out of this wrong decision. Put our tails in. Correct their mistakes. They made mistakes. Let them correct them. We are for it. I want to make sure that I understand you correctly. That is, you want to achieve a negotiated solution to what is happening now in Ukraine, right? Right. But we achieved this. We created a large document in Istanbul, which was signed by the head of the Ukrainian delegation. There his signature is on an excerpt from this agreement, not on the entire document, but on an excerpt from this document. He put his signature, and then he said that they were ready to sign, and then the war would have ended a long time ago, a year and a half ago. But Mr. Johnson arrived, who dissuaded them from this. And they missed this chance. Well, they missed the chance, they made a mistake. Let them get back to it. That's all. But why should we fuss and correct someone's mistakes? I understand that it can be said that it was our mistake, that we intensified actions, and with the help of weapons we decided to end this war, as I said. Started in 2014 in the Donbas. But I'll bring you back even deeper. I've already talked about this. You and I have just discussed this. Then let's go back to 1991, when they promised us not to expand NATO. Let's go back to 2008, when they opened the gates to NATO. Let's go back to the Declaration of Independence of Ukraine, where it declared itself a neutral state. Let's return to the fact that NATO military bases and American bases, British bases, began to appear on the territory of Ukraine. They began to create these threats to us. Let's go back to the fact that they carried out a coup in Ukraine in 2014. It's pointless, right? You can endlessly roll this ball back and forth. But they stopped negotiations. This is mistake? Yes. Please fix this error. We are ready. What else? Don't you think that it would be too humiliating for NATO to now recognize Russia's control over what was Ukrainian territory 2 years ago? But I said, let them think about how to do it with dignity. There are options if they have the desire. Until now, they have been noisy and shouting that it is necessary to achieve a strategic defeat for Russia. Defeat on the battlefield, but now, apparently, they are realizing that this is not easy to do, if at all possible. In my opinion, this is impossible by definition. This will never happen. It seems to me that now awareness of this has come to those who control power in the West. But if this is so, and if this realization has come, then think now what to do next. We are ready for this dialogue. Are you ready to say, for example, to NATO, congratulations, you won. Let's keep the situation as it is now. You know, this is the subject of negotiations that no one wants to conduct with us, or, more precisely, they want to. But they don't know how. I know they want it. Not only can I see it, but I know that they want it. But they just can't figure out how to do it. They thought of it and brought the situation to where we are now. It wasn't us who brought it to this point, but our partners and opponents who brought it to this point. Okay. Now let them think about how to turn it the other way. We don't refuse. It would be funny if it weren't so sad. This endless mobilization in Ukraine, hysteria, internal problems, all this. Sooner or later we will come to an agreement, and, you know, it may even sound strange in today's situation. Relations between peoples will be restored anyway. It will take a long time, but it will recover. I will give unusual examples. There is a clash on the battlefield. This is a specific example. Ukrainian soldiers were surrounded. This is a concrete example from life. There is fighting going on. Our soldiers shout to them, "You have no chance, surrender. Come out and then you will be alive, surrender." And suddenly from there, in good Russian, they shout, "Russians do not give up." And everyone died. They still feel Russian. In this sense, what is happening is, to a certain extent, an element of civil war. And the whole West thinks that the fighting has forever separated one part of the Russian people from the other. No. The reunion will happen. It hasn't gone anywhere. Why are the Ukrainian authorities taking away the Russian Orthodox Church? Because it unites not the territory, but the soul. And no one will be able to divide it. We are finishing? Or do you have something else? This is all. Thank you very much, Mr. President.